Uh, uh,
Toggle.
Testing, testing. Gina, he wants every participant to have a handout, so he's asked me to hand them out, and I'm going to go get them. Okay. Gina, are you ready for me? Okay. Well, we are in, I don't even remember what week. It's been a blur. Week 5. We have more handouts that are being printed, and I will come in the back. So if you didn't get a handout, don't panic. When you see me, raise your hand. I'll be sure, just while Rabbi is speaking, I'll be sure that you get one in your hands. Welcome back to the Law and Religion class. We're so excited to have Rabbi Barry Block with us today. There's a strong relationship, you may or may not know, between Second Presbyterian Church and the temple. And Rabbi may know more about the specifics, but when this church was redoing their roof, they actually held services at Temple B'nai Israel. So they combined buildings and the other way around, Trudy's telling me.
And then when our temple was being built, we had our services here.
I'd forgotten that piece. I've been told that, but I'd forgotten that piece. So that's an interfaith at work right there for sure. And Rabbi Block has taught classes at LifeQuest before, and always welcome to see you back here again. And he readily agreed, but we had to do a little switcheroo in his schedule because he has a big trip coming up. I'm sure he will tell you more about that. I'm going to go run and check on the copies and make sure everybody has those as he's beginning his talk. But if you would help me welcome Rabbi Block.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be with y'all again. I am going to Israel on Sunday for the World Zionist Congress, although that is not the topic of my talk today. And I do want to say a word about the beautiful reciprocal relationship between our congregation. Folks at Second Pres are always so gracious about the way that they say this, as though, it was an equal deal. The folks at Second Pres worshipped at Congregation B'nai Israel about 6 months. B'nai Israel worshipped here for 5 years. So, but it was very nice of them. And it is a good, nice reciprocal relationship, but it wasn't equal. And there's a tapestry out there. I may be pointing the wrong direction, but there. Okay, to mark that. So the people of Israel was born in the land of Israel in the same way that many other ancient civilizations were born, that in no way separated what we think of as religion from the whole culture and the nation. There wasn't even a word for religion. There were what we would call religious practices, but I don't think it's fair to say that in ancient Israel, people had a concept of religion being somewhat separate. Now, to the extent there was something that was quite separate, which was the leadership. Even when you read from the mythic, if you will, formation of the people of Israel in the wilderness, Moses is the leader. You might call him the head of state, although there's no state at that point. But he's clearly the appointed leader. Of course, it isn't unreligious, right? Because he is God's primary agent of bringing redemption to the Jewish people, to the people of Israel, saving them from slavery, leading them through the wilderness, leading them to the border of the promised land. But he is not the person who conducts the religious rituals. That's his brother Aaron, the priest, and Aaron's sons. And in fact, Moses is ineligible for that. So I suppose even you could say that even at a time when there was no conceptual distinction between religion and the people and its civilization, there was a separation of functions. And you may recall that when Moses has brought the Israelites out of Egyptian bondage, he is at Mount Sinai preparing to receive the Torah. But the first thing that happens before he receives the Torah there is that his father-in-law, Jethro, comes. And Jethro, there's an aspect of that calls into question Moses as a family man, because Jethro brings Moses' wife and children back to him, whom he had left with their father and grandfather when he went into Egypt. Okay, fine, he went into a dangerous situation and didn't take his kids and his wife, but he apparently didn't go back to get them. And so, in fact, the father-in-law says, Jethro says, "I have brought your wife and her children." But after what some of us regard as a dig at Moses and the Torah, Jethro sees what Moses is doing. And every Israelite who has any dispute is bringing their disputes to Moses. And there's a lot of Israelites. And there's only one Moses. And what Jethro observes is that people are waiting all day to be heard by Moses. And he also witnesses that Moses is hearing every case, even sort of minor ones. And Jethro says, what you're doing isn't right. It's not good for you, and it's not good for the people. You're going to wear yourself out, you're going to wear them out. Instead, he says, you need to appoint officers. You need to appoint officers who will hear the cases, and, okay, there are going to be cases that are going to be too difficult for anybody else, where the law isn't clear. In that case, of course, they should bring it to you. But they shouldn't bring every case to you. And by the way, there's no distinction between a religious case and a secular case. There's no distinction between a civil case and a criminal case. I don't mean that there aren't penalties for different things and different ways that things are handled, but Torah is not, in other words, and I should tell you what Torah is in case anybody's not familiar with the word. Torah is the 5 books of Moses, and the correct English translation of the word Torah is, does anybody know? Teaching. Very often you will see it as law with a capital L. And if you see that, often in an older Christian translation, but it's not Christian's fault, or at least not at origin. Maybe that they haven't corrected it. But because the original translation of the word Torah into law was done by Jews who didn't have a very good command of Greek. And so it was a mistake. But in any event, that is the teaching of our people. And in Torah, for example, in Leviticus 19, the holiness code, when we're taught, you shall be holy, for Adonai your God is holy, and which on its own is impossible, right? We can't be holy like God is holy. We are completely unlike God. But then it immediately tells us how. Honor your father and mother, observe the Sabbath, don't worship false gods. Items and leave the corners of your field for the poor. So what we think of as ethical mandates and religious mandates, we think there's a separation. We're used to there being a separation. That there are religious mandates, in other words, how you go about worshiping God, how you should and shouldn't worship God, what you should and shouldn't believe, those kinds of things we delegate to religion. Torah is a teaching about how we live our lives altogether. Everything. It covers everything. Administration of state, government, all of that. So at the origins, there isn't a distinction between, if you will, church and state. Now, when Jews study, we typically study from text, and I hope everyone has a source sheet? Does anybody not have a source sheet? Raise your hand. No, everyone has a source sheet. Great. So the first source I've given you here is from Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18. You shall give yourself magistrates and officials for your tribes in all the settlements that Adonai your God is giving you, and they shall govern the people with due justice. So what do we learn from this very brief passage? One sentence. What do we learn? What's commanded here? Have courts. Okay, keep going. What else are we learning? Delegate. Good. They have to govern with due justice. Now, there's all kinds of places in the Torah, and including in chapter 16, very much so, which make very clear that one is not supposed to judge in a way that respects persons. What does that mean? It means that, you don't give deference to the rich and powerful. You don't side with the wealthy simply because they're wealthy, or the powerful because they're powerful. And also, you don't side with the poor because of sympathy. But instead, everything has to be according to what is just. And that prompts Justice Ginsburg to say, in an address she gave in 1995, that the demand for justice runs through the entirety of Jewish tradition. That the line from the Torah that you've heard, of course, justice shall you pursue, is critical, and it continues not only throughout Scripture, but also through other books, such as you might have heard of the term Talmud. Today is not the day for me to describe all of what those books are, but the books of Jewish tradition that shape what Judaism is after the Second Temple is destroyed, at the same era that the Christian fathers are doing their work. All of those books of Judaism are founded on the importance of maintaining justice. And then Hannah Arendt, back in the 40s, said, the only political ideals an oppressed people can have are freedom and justice. Democracy can be their only form of organization. So, Hannah Arendt's writing in 1942. What's she saying? What do you get from the words? 42 is not post-war, during World War II. Not only during World War II, but also during the Holocaust. Right. Okay. So, what's her point? What point is she making? She's making a point that the only way to fight oppression is democracy. That's her argument. Her argument is that democracy, which isn't, I don't think she means pure, like Athenian democracy, the majority rules. But American democracy, for example, with separation of powers, right? That is what protects an oppressed people. Because our Constitution, with its Bill of Rights, and particularly with the post-Civil War amendments that make clear that the Bill of Rights apply to the states, not only preserves the prerogative of the majority to set the nation's course, but also protection of minorities from the tyranny of the majority. Okay? Protection of minorities from the tyranny of the majority. Now, I suspect that all of us can think of ways in which that's not being done in the right way in the United States right now. Okay? I'm going to tell you something about Israel, because it's a case you may not be familiar with. Israel does not have a constitution. It's a very idiosyncratic situation that has to do with when the state was established in 1948, David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister, wanted to include Orthodox Jews and the people. He firmly believed, Ben-Gurion was wrong about some things, and I'm about to tell you a big one he was wrong about. He firmly believed that Zionism, which I suppose I need to define Zionism because it's being so broadly maligned these days. Zionism is the ideology that says that the Jewish people must take responsibility for its own welfare, for its own continuation. It has not worked for 1900 years, is what we would say in 1948. These 1900 years, it's worked okay for a little while here, for a little while there, to live in freedom under somebody else's rule. But long term, this has not worked for the Jewish people, and it's led us, in fact, to the Holocaust. Now, by the way, that notion of what Zionism is arises decades before the Holocaust. So it's to say the Holocaust is only the culmination of extraordinary oppression, primarily in Christian Europe, from the time of the conversion of Constantine through the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, the Christian world grabs its collective heads and really makes some profound changes, which, by the way, gives me some hope. Right? President Trump has been saying that by the way, I'm very grateful to President Trump for what he's doing right now with respect to ending the war and bringing the hostages home. I can't think of anything else I'm grateful to him about, but I'm very grateful to him about that. But he said one thing that's really wrong in the midst of all of that, which is that the conflict is a 3,000-year-old religious conflict. Jews and Muslims have not, for the most part, since the Muslim conquest, been in conflict. There certainly have been times of anti-Semitic uprising, before 1900, I mean. There certainly were times of anti-Semitic uprisings in Muslim countries, but there's no comparison. You had your choice, but from the time of the Muslim conquest to 1900, if you were Jewish, was it better to live under Christian rule or Muslim rule? This is easy. It was better under Muslim rule. All that changes after the Holocaust, as soon as the state of Israel is established. But that's in a way neither here nor there, except to say that Zionism says we have to control our own destiny. Okay, and so when Ben-Gurion establishes this Jewish state, along with other Zionists, he says it needs to be a democracy. But it can't have a constitution because the Orthodox element says, no, the constitution is the Torah. Now, Israel does not establish the Torah as the constitution of the state. Israel does not establish a theocracy. But it doesn't have a constitution for this reason, and it establishes instead a number of basic laws. So, when the current government came to power, which was in December of 2022, in other words, 10 months before the war, 10 months before October 7th, very, very early in that new government, they established, or they attempted to establish, a judicial overhaul. In other words, to unbalance the balance of power. And specifically to legislate that a majority in the Knesset could overrule any ruling of the Supreme Court. So, in other words, they wanted to legislate the tyranny of the majority. So what did ordinary Israelis do? They took to the streets by the tens of thousands, sometimes over 100,000, and, well, collectively across the country, it was over 100,000 repeatedly, every single Saturday night, from January of 23 until October 7th. They did not gather on October 7th. Now, protests restarted in January of 24, and of course those were more about the war and the hostages and all that. But from January to October, I guess September 30th of 23, every single Saturday night, tens if not 100,000 or more Israelis didn't make social plans, or their social plans were, we'll go to the protest and then we'll have dinner. Every week. That's how dedicated they were to maintaining their democracy. Something for us to think about. No Kings was a really big and it was really well done. And Americans were doing something we don't typically do well, which is showing up in large numbers to defend our democracy and without violence or vandalism. We don't have a good history of doing that. But that's what Israelis were able to do consistently for those 9 months, and the worst parts of the judicial overhaul did not happen. Now, don't you worry, he's going to try to do it again. Now, but standing up for democracy has become a strong Jewish cause because we understand what can be done to oppressed minorities. In Israel, the people who are particularly worried are religious non-Orthodox Jews. In other words, the prerogatives of conservative and Reform Jews. The people who are particularly worried are gays and lesbians and transgender folks. People who are particularly should be worried are Arab citizens of Israel, and most of those folks who are out protesting were very, very concerned about Arab citizens of Israel and had a lot to do with why they were out there. So, Hannah Arendt is correct that you have to have a robust, functioning democracy in order to protect the rights of minorities. And she's also reacting to the fact that Hitler ends democracy in Germany, right? And that's what, that's an important enabler of the Holocaust, of the mass murder, attempted extermination of the Jewish people, of the Roman Sinti people, of gay men, and of disabled people, etc. So, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was saved from the Nazis by the Hebrew Union College, which is the rabbinical seminary where I was ordained of Reform Judaism. And he was brought to the Hebrew Union College among a group of scholars with the notion that they would teach there, and that's how they were rescued. But Heschel wasn't a Reform Jew. And so ultimately he was a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary. His quote is still at the bottom of the first page. So Heschel is a professor at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which is the conservative movement's seminary, and he regularly marches with Dr. King. So a lot of the pictures where you see Dr. King and then there's a bearded rabbi next to him, that's Heschel. Okay? And he says, prayer is meaningless unless it is subversive, unless it seeks to overthrow and ruin the pyramids of callousness, hatred, opportunism, falsehoods. The liturgical movement must become a revolutionary movement seeking to overthrow the forces that continue to destroy the promise, the hope, and the vision. Now, Heschel's been dead for, 30 years, but it's not hard. I mean, that sounds like somebody could say that right now, right? So what's Heschel calling for? He's calling on religious groups to do something. What's he calling on us to do? Well, don't just rely on prayer, or maybe to direct our prayer in a particular way, not to reinforce harmful hierarchies in our prayers. I will give you a more recent example when I heard this specifically in Arkansas. Joyce Elliott, may her healing continue, stood up on the Capitol steps at the time that Roe versus Wade was overthrown. And she said, I'm going to say something that's hard, which is that we all need to stop being part of even religious traditions that put women second. That what's happening here is because of putting women second, and that's not okay, and we have to even say that in our churches and to our churches. And I would say synagogues also, but she was speaking as a Christian, primarily to Christians. But it reminded. I mean, when I read this quote by Heschel, I thought, wow, that reminds me of what Joyce Elliott said much more recently. So, founding documents of American democracy demonstrate the antipathy of democracy to monarchy in many ways. Perhaps surprisingly, they're paralleled in the Torah. Now, the Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States. And the Declaration of Independence says the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over these states. He's plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of free people. We therefore, okay, so then they establish the United States as independent, right? So this notion of no kings is paralleled in Torah. This quote here from Exodus chapter 6, verse 1, Adonai said to Moses, "You shall soon see what I will do to Pharaoh. He shall let them go because of a greater might. Indeed, because of a greater might, he shall drive them from his land." In other words, he ain't the king, I am, says God. But more to the point, In Deuteronomy, in chapter 17, we hear some very significant ambivalence about having a king. Right here in our sacred text. If after you have entered the land that Adonai your God has assigned to you, and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by Adonai your God. Be sure to set his king for yourself, one of your own people. By the way, that seems like that provision in our Constitution that you have to be born in this country. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not one of your kinsmen. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since Adonai has warned you, you must not go back that way. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching, in other words, the Torah, written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priest. Let it remain with him, and let him read in it all his life, so that he may learn to revere Adonai his God, to observe faithfully every word of this Torah, this teaching, as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily toward his fellows or deviate from the instruction to the right or to the left, to the end that he and his descendants may long reign in the midst of Israel. Now, most of us understand that these words are written long after Israel and Judea have kings. Okay? So even though it's set on the banks of the Jordan River before the people enter the land, those who accept academic Bible scholarship say, it's written later. It's written when there are kings. Okay, so what's the concern about these kings that's articulated here? What are some of the concerns? Aggrandizing wealth. That like using their position to enrich themselves. Anybody here worried about that? Okay. What else?
Nationalism becoming our God.
Nationalism becoming our God. Worried about that because what is the ruler? God is the ruler. And how does God communicate those rules? Scripture is what we're being told. Many of you, I feel certain, and not only Fred and Trudy, have been in the sanctuary of Congregation B'nai Israel. And if you have seen that when you're sitting here facing, I guess we're facing Congregation B'nai Israel, right? We're facing that way, I think. I get a little turned around. But when you're facing the front from the seats in Congregation B'nai Israel, there are those beautiful windows that Trudy's brother designed. The whole thing is magnificent. And then in the middle, this beautiful ark where the Torah scrolls are kept. And the center Torah has on it a silver crown. Well, what is indicated by the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, having a silver crown on it? That's the king. That's the queen. That's the sovereign. The sovereign is the words of Torah in a world where we don't receive direct revelation. Okay, I guess that some people think they do receive direct revelation, but most of us don't. And by the way, it's actually a principle of Judaism that we do not receive direct revelation since Malachi. Okay, so this year, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is to say the organization of more than 2,000 Reform rabbis in North America and worldwide, adopted the resolution that I'm going to present to you. Now, before I added this to the source sheet, the source sheet was prepared by somebody else, as I've acknowledged at the top, and I did some editing throughout, but I also added this. And I added it with a bit of trepidation because I'm concerned on the one hand, that it could come off as offensive to Christians, although I tend to think not Christians who would be here today. I think. Actually, my greater concern was that members of Congregation B'nai Israel would be very frightful, that this would be would be more frightful than I am about my sharing this text with Christians. But I think we're safe. But please, actually, if you find something that's offensive about it, please don't hesitate to speak up. So, background, the American Jewish community has long held a deep commitment to the ideals of democracy, liberty, religious freedom, and a robust establishment clause. Establishment clause, the First Amendment, right? That the state shall not establish religion. Forging a separation of church and state. Values enshrined in the founding principles of the United States of America. For the first time in 2,600 years of Jewish diaspora history, this promised a nation in which one's rights as a citizen would not depend upon their religious beliefs, religious identity, or religious practices. So this is a strong statement of America is good for the Jews. America is not only good for the Jews, but unique in history as a place where Jews can live safely under the way that this nation has been organized. Jewish participation in the American experiment dates to 1654, when the first Jews to land in New Amsterdam demanded equal rights. So the governor of New Amsterdam, Stuyvesant, tried to expel the Jews. The Dutch East India Company had different ideas and told him so. And the Jews demanded equal rights, wrote off. So what did they do? They wrote to the folks at the Dutch East India Company who had encouraged them to come. Those first Jews, by the way, came to New Amsterdam from Recife, Brazil, primarily. My first ancestors to come to this country came just a tiny bit later from Curacao, and they were all sent by the Dutch East India Company as the Portuguese had conquered Dutch territories in South America. So they said, okay, they had sent them and they wanted them to go to New Amsterdam. So they petitioned for their own rights to the Dutch East India Company. Said, nope, Governor Stuyvesant, got to let him be okay there. President George Washington, this is an important part of American Jewish history that I suspect many people don't know. President George Washington memorably affirmed this vision of America. In response to an inquiry from the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, President Washington assured that the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but demands that all men shall be free to profess and worship God in their own way. So, now, those words were actually written by somebody named Isaac Seixas, one of the members of the Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island. But President Washington received the inquiry that included the question, is this true of America? And he wrote it back as an affirmation. Washington at that time, by the way, was going around the country campaigning for the adoption for the ratification of the Bill of Rights. Throughout the over 200 years since, American Jews, including members of the Reform movement, that's who's talking here, and members of all religious minorities, have celebrated and enjoyed the fruits of the expressed commitment to a pluralistic democracy and American society. As a result, the United States has given its Jewish community more rights, more freedom, and more opportunity than we have ever known in diaspora life. Ever known outside of our own sovereignty. Ever. It is also with this experience in mind that the American Reform movement promotes inclusion and culture of mutual understanding and acceptance that celebrates human dignity through our adherence to B'Tselem Elohim, it's a Hebrew term which is going to be translated, The belief that God created all people in the divine image. Okay, so everybody's equal. Everybody's created in the divine image. And part, by the way, of the subtext here is that if people are gay, that means that God creates gay people. If people are transgender, that means God creates transgender people. That's an important part of what is being articulated here. Today, in violation of Washington's vision and our embrace of it, we face threats from rising white Christian nationalism spreading throughout American society and, to our great alarm, our government. Okay, I hope you don't hear that as a blanket criticism of Christianity. That would be the worry. I'm seeing a lot of shaking heads. Nobody's seeing it. People are not seeing it that way. Good. White Christian nationalism is a political and cultural ideology that seeks to merge the identity of the state with conservative evangelical Christianity. So what's the concern here? We're establishing a religious government. Or to put it in other terms we hear all the time, that this is a Christian nation. It's a nation in which the majority are Christian. It's also based on the Baba Misa, which is Yiddish for baloney, and that's the clean term, that the Baba Misa that the founders intended to establish a Christian state, which is just baloney. So the ideology is often accompanied by a racially exclusionary vision that emphasizes white dominance in political, social, and cultural structures, rewrites U.S. history to exaggerate the Christian motivation of the founders, downplays the history and contributions of non-Jews and of communities of color, acts as though democratic processes can be viewed as secondary to achieving a divinely ordained social order, thus justifying anti-democratic actions as necessary to fulfill a religious mission, depicts non-white immigration and demographic changes as an existential danger to America, and tries to revamp school curricula, library holdings, and media coverage to emphasize Christian nationalist values. Now that's a mouthful. And it's a lot. Does anybody have any questions about what's being written there? Or comment about any of those? Yeah, please. I'll repeat it, don't worry.
Does not square with Jesus' teachings and the Christianity that came from him. And I wonder if it had anything, if the nationalism has anything to do with the effect of the Roman culture on Christianity.
So I don't know the answer to your question, I'm afraid. But tell me your name. Sorry, I know you told me.
My name is Pat Chambers.
So Pat has said, that it seems to him that Christian nationalism is inconsistent with the words of Jesus. That seems clear to me. Then he said something that I think it would be better addressed by a Christian leader, which is about whether that comes from the Roman influence in the Christian church and Paul. I'm out of my league on that particular question. That's not my area of expertise. But I mean, look, people pervert religion to make it what they want it to be. That's not unusual, right? So I would say that, I am particularly sensitive to the situation in the occupied West Bank today. Because what's happening under the current government, the way that Netanyahu forged his current government is that he brought into his coalition two fascist parties. One headed by a guy named Itamar Ben-Gvir, whom he has put in charge of the police throughout Israel. So, for example, there was on Israel Memorial Day. Memorial Day in Israel is actually brilliant, and if we could change our calendar in America, it would make so much sense. It's the day before Independence Day. So there is a very clear message of the connection between the sacrifices of those who've died in battle to the creation of the state. Well, there's a group, worldwide group, but it's really in Israel and Palestine, that there is a group called the Parents Circle Family Forum. It's made up of folks who've been bereaved in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict who argue nonviolence. So they had their own Memorial Day observance that recognized both Israeli and Palestinian losses. And at a congregation in Ra'anana, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, this was screened because, by the way, the observance was held in an undisclosed location because they were very worried about violence. So it was screened in Ra'anana, and what happened? The leader of the Likud party, Netanyahu's party, in Ra'anana, called for hooligans to go and harass the people going to that and violently attack them. A friend of mine was injured because, but in any event, and it was horrible. Like, for example, one friend of mine talked about she and her elderly mother going in there were repeatedly kicked. And, I mean, like, she says, never mind being screamed at and spat upon. We were kicked. I mean, what kind of craziness is that? And the police were told in advance that this was a concern, and they weren't there. Now, they did come afterwards and escorted people to their cars. But a great deal of violence had happened already. The police did not keep the people out. And why? Because Itamar Ben-Gvir wants this. By the way, what happens with Palestinians is way worse than what happens to liberal Jews, but it happens to liberal Jews too. So in the other fascist leader he brought into his government's name is Bezalel Smotrich. And Bezalel Smotrich is the finance minister, but what he insisted on is that he also be a minister in the Defense Department, where he would be in charge of the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, in the occupied West Bank. So, I mean, there was a brazen murder of a Palestinian peace activist in the South Hebron Hills that was captured on somebody's cell phone video, and they weren't ever prosecuted. So it's a terrible, dangerous, murderous problem. I realize my time is up, and we'll have time in the lobby. I want to just read through this, and then you want to continue the conversation, we'll go out into the lobby. Such rhetoric and advocacy intensify conditions in which anti-Semitism on the right flourishes. By the way, we don't deny anti-Semitism on the left. That's just a separate document. Incidents in concert with or inspired by white Christian nationalism have too often led to violence. They include the Unite the Right rally. Jews will not replace us. I'm going to skip to the next bullet. The attack on the nation's capital on January 6, 2021. Not primarily an anti-Semitic attack, but they're carrying I mean, really, they're carrying swastika flags and Confederate flags, etc. The proliferation of great replacement theories, it also inspired other incidents of, do you know what the great replacement theory is? So don't you know that we, the Jewish people, have a plan to replace the white majority in America with immigrants of color? We're behind the whole thing. Okay, no, and that was what the mass murderer, anti-Semitic mass murderer in Pittsburgh in 2018, that was his motivation. Whereas the Jewish community and other minority faiths have thrived thanks to the American commitment to religious freedom and the separation of church and state, and whereas the Jewish community has a historical understanding of the dangers posed by ideologies that seek to divide us along racial, religious, and cultural lines, and whereas white Christian nationalism, rhetoric, and actions have contributed significantly to spurring anti-Semitism on the right, and whereas the rise of white Christian nationalism threatens the fundamental principles of religious liberty, equality, and freedom that are central to our American and Jewish identities, whereas white Christian nationalism is an ideology rooted in exclusion, prejudice, and hatred that marginalizes communities that do not conform to their narrow definitions of identity, including Jews, people of color, LGBTQ plus individuals, and religious and ethnic minorities. And whereas white Christian nationalists seek to redefine America falsely as a Christian nation, which is inconsistent with U.S. history and with both the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, therefore be it resolved that the Central Conference of American Rabbis condemns the harmful ideologies of white Christian nationalism and commits to vigorously opposing policies rooted in or advancing white Christian nationalism, advocates for engagement in thoughtful and constructive discussions about the dangers of white Christian nationalism, including across lines of difference and in interfaith partnerships as we are today, commits to continuing to work alongside all marginalized communities, standing in solidarity with the vulnerable, confronting and dismantling systems of hate and oppression, and promoting the values of inclusion and justice, reaffirms our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that ensure all American citizens feel welcomed, valued, and empowered in civic engagement and opportunity, and ensures that Jews are included wherever appropriate in DEI efforts, calls on national and state elected officials to stand firmly against all forms of hate, bigotry, and extremism, and remain committed to the just and equitable society that are the highest ideals of America. Friends, we have a government today that supports bigotry, that propagates and supports bigotry. And when I say we have a government today that supports and propagates bigotry, I am speaking of the government of the United States of America, and I am speaking of the government of Arkansas. I will conclude with one Arkansas example. You may know, you may have read in the paper that there is a group that is brazenly violating the Fair Housing Act and establishing a white Christian-only colony in Arkansas, in northeast Arkansas. And I brought it to the Attorney General's attention, and he immediately made a statement against it. I sent it to somebody who I'm on the board of our house with, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff to the governor. Maybe you received a response. I did not. And maybe you saw the governor's statement about why this isn't okay, but I did not. It's because she didn't make one. And the Attorney General concluded that there was no way to prosecute them. So methinks that the Attorney General was schooled after he made his statement that there's no place for racism in Arkansas. I think the governor's silence speaks loud and clear. There is very much a place for racism, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism, anti-Islamophobia, anti-LGBT, etc., in Arkansas. So on that cheery note, we'll gather